That's great.
I was about to move on to the 4th of June 2015, and there's evidence available to the chair that the officers agreed to provide statements to PIRC. Roughly the communication began on the 2nd of June, and then as I understand it, arrangements were made for the officers to attend and provide those statements.
Yes.
Were you aware that that had moved on from the initial stages?
Yeah.
And as I understand it, some of the officers were in different locations, some of them were in the same location. They weren't all together.
When the interviews took place?
When the interviews took place.
I think the majority from memory were done at offices at Scottish Police College.
And were there, when it was arranged, were there 2 PIRC investigators interviewing every officer?
Yes.
Was it all happening at the same time, or was it?
Yes.
Yeah. And were arrangements made, or was there to be breaks during that period?
Yes.
And were those breaks designed to allow the PIRC investigators to confer, maybe compare what the officers were saying?
I think both, just as far as comfort breaks as well. I think they were fairly lengthy as well.
Right. And as I understand it, those statements were taken over the course of that day on the 4th of June.
Well.
And this would be PIRC getting the accounts of the attending officers, and that would be the first accounts they'd received from those officers.
Yes.
Did you at any stage become involved in doing comparisons between statements or considering versions that had been given by different officers?
After these statements were
After
taken?
the statements were taken?
I don't think so. No, I have no recollection.
Or during the breaks, were you involved in any discussions?
Possibly dialogue with other investigators who weren't involved directly in the interviews, possibly, but I can't remember any specific conversations around that.
Do you remember actively discussing issues with any of the other investigators in relation to accounts that were being given?
I don't have any direct recollection of doing that.
Let's look at your second inquiry statement. First of all, this is covered in paragraphs 166 to 175, and we'll get that on the screen. So that's PI 00382. And if we look at paragraph 166, first of all, there we are, 4th of June 2015, and you'll see that you're being asked a question in connection with you taking a statement from PC Craig Walker, and you're asked about the process and the statement taking and your impressions, and your answer is, I have some limited recollection of taking the statement at the Scottish Police College with investigator, is that Ungi?
Ungi, yeah.
Ungi. I followed a witness interview strategy while taking the statement. However, I do not have sufficient recollection of PC Walker to provide any impressions of him. A number of PIRC investigators were taking witness statements at the same time at the Scottish Police College. However, I cannot recall what contact I had with them during this period. And then over the course of the next few answers that you've given, you talk again about the witness interview strategy, and I won't need to go through all of these answers, and your contact with PC Walker. So was that the task you were allocated that day, along with the other investigator, was to take a statement from Constable Walker?
Yes, it was.
And we've heard evidence that he was one of the first 2 officers at the scene.
Yes.
In terms of your approach, did you consider him to be quite a significant witness?
Yes.
And was that one of the reasons you were selected to take his statement? Because of your experience?
Possibly, I don't know definitively, but I would think so.
Right. Let's look at that witness interview strategy. It's PIRC 04182. Now, do you know anything about how this strategy was prepared, collated?
Yeah, I think from memory, we have qualified or trained interview advisors, and I think they created that. Obviously from a lot of information that was accrued during the course of the inquiry up to that date. Obviously we then had, eyewitness accounts and information from a variety of locations, so there'd be a kind of summary of events, which I think is there, is created, and then work out in conjunction with the lead investigators what questions are going to be posed. A lot of these will be unique to that individual, but probably the majority in this instance would be similar as regards how they became involved in the incident, what they actually did at specific times, what use of force, etc.
Do you recognise the front page of this as we've been provided with one witness interview strategy, so this appears to be a generic
Yes,
version. Was it a generic version that was prepared for your use on the 4th of June?
Yes, but I think that was, each of them was specific to certain officers, I think, from recollection. I don't know if all the questions were exactly the same, I don't remember.
I see. So you think there may have been a specific witness interview strategy for each individual officer?
Yeah, I don't remember fully, but I would anticipate that might have been the case, but I'm not sure.
Is that something that's commonly done?
It would be, because depending on their involvement, like somebody is front and centre of what's happened, but somebody else is maybe coming after the events, but for whatever reason they decide there's a strategy is required for that individual, then they would probably be quite different.
Is that common practice now for PIRC when they're interviewing officers to be looking for a specific witness interview strategy?
Yeah, it's not that often, it's not that common that would use this. It's obviously a very critical incident that we would create these to support. Other than that, in normal investigations, the lead investigator would create something on a smaller scale for the interviewing investigators and specific to that inquiry, but this is not particularly common to go into this significant detail.
So in a more common PIRC investigation, if there is such a thing, there will maybe be fewer witnesses.
Yeah, fewer witnesses, maybe not as wide array of information that requires to be obtained in relation to whatever incident it is we're investigating.
So in a smaller PIRC investigation, you may have individual strategies for individual witnesses.
Possibly, yeah.
Possibly. Yeah. But more commonly, is there simply no strategy and PIRC rely on the experience of office investigators such as yourself?
To some degree. I mean, the actions that we create, that's a kind of computer-generated document that will outline the information that we expect to get or want to get from a specific witness. There'll probably be details within that, but say there was a lot of information to obtain, and we obviously wanted to try and get that without follow-ups if that was possible.
Could I just clarify something, please, Mr. Harrower? When you talk about interview advisors,
yes,
who are they? I mean, are they PIRC officers?
They are the PIRC investigators who have a trained skill set in relation to supporting major investigations, where part of that function is to create documentation. And that can either be for witness strategies or for suspect persons occasionally as well, in preparation for an interview.
Thank you.
Do you remember which advisor prepared the witness interview strategy here?
I'm afraid not, no, I don't remember.
Is that something that the lead investigator would be liaising with the advisor on?
I would say so, yes. Yeah.
So whoever was the lead investigator on or prior to the 4th of June, he'd be the best person to
Yes,
ask
they
about
they
this.
would be very au fait with what was contained within that, and May would certainly have input to that as well.
Right. And had you used a witness interview strategy document in any investigations in PIRC prior to the 3rd of May 2015?
I don't know about prior, certainly after that, I think. I wouldn't be able to say what it was, but I've certainly used it in the last 11 years. I say it's not common, it's not something I would use very often.
Do you have any recollection of using a strategy such as this prior to the 3rd of May?
Not specifically, no, I wouldn't be sure on that.
Had you been given any training or guidance about the use of a witness interview strategy during the process of taking a statement?
No,
Had you used these when you were a police officer?
yes,
And did you have experience of using these when you were involved in major crimes?
major crime investigation. Yeah.
Had you had training with the police on how to use these strategies?
No, I don't think it was. There was obviously specific training for the interview advisors that are referred to in creating these, but not for implementation and taking statements. I don't think it may have been incorporated within certain courses and touched on, but it wasn't, to my recollection, specific training.
Do you remember any courses that touched on how to use a witness interview strategy effectively?
No, I would be guessing if probably one in particular, but I wouldn't. I couldn't be factual over whether that was the case.
All right. So if we move down this first page, we see it's in relation to the death of Mr. Bio, and it gives his date of birth, and then there is a list of bullet points of officers who are to be questioned in terms of this witness interview strategy.
Yes.
And they range through Peyton, Walker, Gibson, Tomlinson, Good, Maxwell, McDonough, Short, Smith, and you were to be interviewing Craig Walker.
Yes.
And if we can move on to the next page, we see the summary and the opening paragraph comments that there are a number of calls received reporting a black male in possession of a knife on Hendry Road, near to Hayfield Road. And then it goes through the identities of the 9 officers and the report that was made. And it says they saw a male walking towards them, that he may have been in possession of a knife. Comment, it may be that the knife was discarded before this. Now that appears to be a change in the summary compared to the information you'd had previously.
Yeah, that's, as I referred to there, that this should be and would be up to date with the investigation at that stage, that things had moved on, and obviously to establish where the knife had been recovered, and potentially that wasn't as initially reported in the early information.
Right. And the comment there is that it may be that the knife was discarded before this, and that would be on the basis of further information that's come to
Yes.
the attention of PIRC. The officers exited their vehicles. It was reported that the male punched, then kicked PC Nicole Short. Some officers drew their police issue batons. Some of the officers also drew their PAVA and CS sprays, which were subsequently sprayed towards the male. However, it is believed that this had little effect. So, however, continuing in this paragraph, does it appear that the primary report there is that the male punched and kicked Nicole Short, and then the officers drew their batons and their sprays. So again, it appears at this stage the information was still that subject, aggressor, police
Still
responding.
That, part of that original narrative.
Right. And then I believe the officers struck the now deceased with their batons. A struggle then ensued, and the now deceased was eventually taken to the ground where he was handcuffed and leg restraints were applied. About 7:30 hours, still on the ground, he lost consciousness and an ambulance was summoned, and officers attempted CPR. He was conveyed by ambulance to Kirkcaldy Victoria Hospital, Medical staff continued to treat him, but at 0904, life was pronounced extinct. And that's essentially an update on information that you'd presumably now gathered in
Yes.
as part of the PIRC investigation. So on the next page, page 3, the purpose of the interview is set out. Now, would this document have been made available to you prior to going to interview Craig Walker, to give you
Yes.
the opportunity to read through it?
Yes.
And it says here to carry out a planned and structured interview of the police witness, to achieve a detailed account of their movements, intentions and actions leading up to, during and immediately after contact with Mr. Bio. Additionally, to obtain details of the post-incident process and what discussion, if any, was held between the officers regarding the incident. To obtain details of briefings and other information provided to the officers by Federation staff and senior officers of Police Scotland. And so it would appear that the purpose of the interview was to find out about the movements of the officers, and I think at that stage you'd not had any initial accounts, so
No.
that was that still unclear to PIRC at that time?
Yes.
What the initial movements had been.
Yes.
And then to look at their intentions of the officers. What was your understanding of that word?
Sorry, where was that?
So it's on the second line in the middle. The purpose of the interview to carry out a planned and structured interview of the police witness to achieve a detailed account of their movements, intentions.
Intense, I would take that to mean that they were considering what they were attending, maybe listening to radio messages as they approached it. Did they have some sort of intended plan of action in response to whatever they saw when they arrived?
So what was going on in their mind?
What was going on in their head, what they were balancing up, what's my alternatives here as I approach? Could it be A, B, C or D or anything else?
Yeah. Looking at alternative options
Yes.
and considering one rather than the other.
Yeah.
And then their actions themselves. So the consequences of those movements and intentions would be looking at the actions of the
And what
officers.
they actually did when they arrived in response to what they saw.
On this date, were PIRC still unclear as to what actions had been taken by individual officers?
I think generally speaking, yes. I mean, I think by that time there would have been some eyewitness evidence and potentially other material available at the time. I don't think it mentions it there as regards CCTV, other footage, and I say descriptions of actions of officers at that time.
Okay, so would you, in the purpose of the interview, expect to find details of things like CCTV that was available, or statements, significant statements that were available, or comments that had been made, or airwaves, or storm records? Would you expect any of that in the purpose?
Certainly the interviewing officers to be aware of anything specific that may impact on the statement and the truth of what they're actually been told.
Were you given, was the expectation that in advance of this interview you would go and identify significant evidence that you should be aware of before you interviewed PC Walker?
Yeah, I don't know the specifics of that, but anybody should be armed with all the relevant information to the task in hand, which, I mean, that's a significant task as regards getting the full account from these individual officers. So. But I don't know to what extent that was done. I have no recollection of that.
I mean, was it your normal practice to go and read significant evidence or look at CCTV footage before you interview?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, and maybe a kind of description of a lesser type incident that if you had CCTV or if you had account from independent witnesses, then you would be completely au fait with that, and you would look at the CCTV, you would read these accounts, and you would frame in your mind all the various different versions of different parts of the incident, if that was the case.
And was that part of your normal preparation?
Yes.
In advance of an interview?
Yes.
So in the period between the 2nd of June and the 4th of June, when you actually took Craig Walker's statement, would you have spent some of that time at least preparing for the interview?
Certainly beforehand, yeah, absolutely.
And then it goes on to say, additionally, to obtain details of the post-incident process and what discussion was held between the officers. What was that a reference to?
Basically, after the incident, when during the course of returning or having returned to the office, accounts of that activity and what their knowledge of the process that occurred immediately after the incident involving all the police Scotland staff that were managing and assisting with the incident.
We heard yesterday when I asked you to look at a number of documents at the beginning of your evidence about conferring.
Yes.
And warnings in relation to that. Would that have covered any possible conferring between officers?
Yeah, well, you would elicit from them, basically what happened during a period from whatever time you returned to the office till you left to go home, and fill in all those blanks and give their account of what happened and any significant discussions or actions.
And then finally, to obtain details of briefings and other information provided by Federation staff and senior officers.
Yes.
As part of this, did you consider, for example, a statement by Amanda Given, who was the Federation rep, who had, I think I asked you to comment on some of that yesterday, about the status of the officers and whether that had been clarified. So again, did you familiarise yourself with statements from Federation reps?
We would have done. I can't remember when she was interviewed, whether she was interviewed before or after that. I would anticipate it was before. I would have done. That would have been significant as well. Anybody that's feeding into, that had contact with these officers, that may have relevant information that should be aware of, just to assure us as much as possible that the account we're getting is accurate and honest.
Okay. And then it recognises a situation where it may appear an officer incriminates himself during that statement giving, and gives direction on what to do in the situation. And then initially you were to request the witness to verbally recall their recollection of events prior to noting the statement.
Yeah.
And is that the process that you followed with Constable Walker?
Yes, although it was slightly different with him due to his actions at the beginning of that.
Did he give you a self-penned statement?
He did, yeah.
So when he gave you that, we've heard evidence from Constable Walker that he prepared a statement and gave it to you at the outset. Did you have an opportunity to read that statement?
I'm sure I did before we started, yeah. And then it was, I think that was passed on to the management team.
Thank you. The next page essentially is a list of points in relation to the background of the officer. Are these points that the strategy is designed to get out of the officer as well?
Yeah, these are specific, unique information to them as far as their own police numbers and specific training dates, location worked, and current duties.
And then on page 5, a number of points regarding the description of the officer. Again, generic questions that can be asked of each officer.
Yeah, but still important in their own right, particularly for sort of independent witnesses describing actions of specific officers.
Weight isn't included in that strategy.
No, but build is, but yeah, no, it's not.
All right. Page 6, it says introduction. Ask the officer to provide in their own words details of their duty on Sunday the 3rd of May. If necessary, ask the following questions for clarity if the officer does not provide such information. And we can see a number of questions there focused towards the shift, the office they were working from, when they got to work, the duties they were doing, and just general questions that would allow you to identify where they were and what they were doing that day.
Yes, just a kind of painting a picture of the build-up to it.
And then underneath that, there's a muster. We've heard evidence from the officers about a muster. And again, you're trying to find out who attended, who carried out the muster, what supervisors were present. So at that stage, you didn't have any of that information available to you? Or were you simply using this as a way of...
I don't know,
Easy.
they may have already acquired statements from supervisors who are not directly involved in the incident, which may have filled the gaps.
Right.
Some of that information, I don't know at what stage they have been taken or followed up.
And then page 7, incident attendance. You were to ask the officers details of their attendance at the incident, and that covers the topics of knowledge of the locus and knowledge of the incident, and information that they were sent and location and such like. Then page 8 is about arrival at the locus. So essentially this is going through the events of the 3rd of May in chronological order.
Correct. Without, obviously occasions that some of that information might be missed in a statement if it wasn't listed initially as a specific question to ask.
So it may be that with individual witnesses you will have known some of the information or some of the answers to the questions, but this was put down to be thorough, to ask all the questions that they wanted you to cover. And there's also reference on page 8 to a map towards the bottom. We've seen copies of maps that officers drew on to identify their location at Hayfield Road.
Yes.
Is that the maps that were used?
Yes.
Were you given copies of those to use as part of the strategy?
Yes, I used that during the interview.
And some of the questions about arrival do ask about when Mr. Bile was first seen, was he in possession of anything, a knife, where was it, and questions of that sort.
Yes.
And then on the next page, page 9, it asks about initial dealings with the deceased, and this is primarily focused about what the officers did, what the officers said, and what the officers heard.
Yes.
Then page 10, arrest and restraint. Again, the focus is on what the officers did, what other officers did, and what they may have seen, and how Mr. Bio reacted to those steps. And then the next page, page 11, it deals with post-arrest and medical care, and then it goes on to the post-incident procedures and other ancillary details to be obtained.
Yes.
Can we look at the pages 9 and 10? We've heard evidence at the inquiry that it's necessary. Officers, if they use force during the course of their duties, that they have to justify that use of force. And that's an important part of their obligations as officers.
Yes.
You agree with
Yes.
agree with that? And that as part of that justification, they have to provide that in relation to every single use of force that they have adopted. So if, I think an example was given in evidence, if someone is struck 3 times with a baton, that officer has to justify each individual strike of that baton. That's correct.
Yes.
And we've been given evidence on the inquiry that every use of force to be legal has to be necessary, it has to be reasonable, and the officer has to use the absolute minimum level of force. Yes. And we've also heard about preclusion. It's important that officers consider other, maybe less forceful options.
Tactical options, yeah.
Yes. And they either have to try them and they fail, so they escalate, or they have to take the view based on their experience and their knowledge and their training that that's not worth trying. And I would like to know, in relation to this witness strategy, because I've read through it, there don't appear to be any questions at all about inviting officers to justify the use of force. And I wondered if that was something that was obvious to you on the day.
I think once you got to that point in the statement, you know, that would be certainly, you would be progressing on certain points in relation to that. That would just be a natural progression, a part of the evidence you're getting from that individual. I don't think you could ever have a position where you have every question that you need answered, because one thing leads to another on most occasions when you're interviewing witnesses. So this was a guide that was to provide an initial standard to make sure that we got. I take your point on, you know, the justification for that, and that you may consider that the absence of that is significant, but certainly that's something I would be asking during the course of the interview, if it got to that point that somebody was describing an incident, part of that incident where force was being used, because that's the crux, the major crux of the account you're getting.
So if the use of force is the major crux, would it be your normal practice to ask questions like, why did you think it was necessary to use that force at that time?
Why did you preclude the other options? How quickly did you go through that process of considering the extent of danger that you faced, that you went from option 1 to option 4, for instance, straight away, and they should be able to justify that.
We've heard evidence about a SOP that the police use, which has profiled offender behaviour categorised at that time, and also at that time had a reasonable officer response categorised, with level 5 being lethal force or deadly force. So would it have been your practice to ask questions about why did you use that level of force? Was there not another option available? Why did you not de-escalate, that type of thing?
Yes.
And any of those answers given to those questions would have been noted down in the statement?
Would have been incorporated into the statement.
Right. As I've looked through this strategy, the other area that appeared to be absent was any questions in relation to the impact of race. There's no reference at all to race in the witness strategy.
No, there's not.
And you obviously explained to us yesterday about keeping an open mind. And I'm wondering to what extent you were able to both keep an open mind yet not ask any questions about race in the statement taking. If you're not asking any questions about it, is that reflective of truly keeping an open mind about the question of race?
I said to you, my belief is that personally I've kept an open mind during that. Again, it's an issue we've raised that's not incorporated within that. I don't know if anything was asked at any of the interviews in relation to that. You may be aware of that already, but.
Well, there's not. I'm really just asking about the witness interview strategy at the moment. Do you think that might have been of use to have some strategy or some questions prepared and available for you as the investigator taking a statement, to have a page perhaps about possible questions that could be asked in relation to race?
There may be a reason why that specific question is not there, but I'm not aware of that.
And there was no questions, as far as I can see, about racial discrimination or mindset in relation to race at all. Do you remember being encouraged to ask any questions about that?
No, I don't have any recollection of that.
Were you generally encouraged to ask additional questions and prepare additional pages for the witness interview strategy? I mean, would it have been within your power to maybe add in another page about questions to do with use of force and justification or racial discrimination?
I think if there was something obvious that was considered absent, why the individuals that are going to conduct that interview, then that conversation would probably take place prior to the interview.
Certainly there are no questions about intention or use of force and mindset in the strategy. Not all officers are as experienced as you are, Mr. Harry. Do you think that perhaps even less experienced investigators may benefit from a more fulsome strategy?
They could do, yeah.
We've heard, we have statements from a Ross Stewart and a Brian Dodd. I think we've mentioned
Brian
at least
already, yeah.
Brian Dodd before. Ross Stewart is an investigator for PIRC. He interviewed Sergeant Maxwell, who was the acting sergeant for the response team on the 3rd of May. He said, "I do not recall considering specifically asking Sergeant Maxwell why he took a particular course of action. I do not recall being encouraged to ask why." So it doesn't appear that Investigator Stewart considered asking questions about justification for use of force or intention in relation to use of force. And then Brian Dodd, who took a statement from PC Tomlinson, says in his statement, "To my knowledge, PIRC investigators were not encouraged to add their own questions to the witness interview strategy prior to or during the interview, or encouraged to ask why officers took certain decisions or actions." Do you want to comment on that, about the lack of
Well,
encouragement?
probably what I'd said already, that during the course of the interview, that there's different strands will come out, and I would expect anyone with any investigative experience at all to then expand on that and ask the appropriate questions. And that may not fit anywhere within that original strategy, but the expectation is that you would follow that through and record the answers to these questions.
I mean, certainly.
It's not specific, follow that and nothing else. That's definitely not what it is.
I mean, Mr. Dodd does seem to say investigators were not encouraged to add their own questions. Do you think some investigators felt they were constrained by the strategy?
I wouldn't say so, no.
That wasn't your experience?
No.
So if you had felt it appropriate, well, you said normal practice would be to ask for justification of use of force. If you'd felt it appropriate, you could have asked questions about possible racial discrimination or the mindset of officers in relation to race, if you'd wished to do so. Yeah. I'd like to move on and ask you about expert witnesses. Now, you've spoken in your statement about part of the PIRC investigation involving the need to go to experts, mainly medical or forensic experts, to provide additional opinion and evidence available for PIRC.
Yes.
And I think you were involved to some extent in instructing or being involved in that process of instructing experts.
Yeah, and the preparation and delivery in some fashion of packages.
I think you had prepared, at least for Dr. Payne James and a number of other witnesses, such as Dr. Karch, what was called an expert witness package.
Yes.
Can you explain to people what an expert witness package, what that was?
From memory, it was, you would have a summary of the incident within that, any reference to any other evidence which built the picture for the expert. You would outline what you were looking for them to achieve, what their expertise was required for, and there would be initial contact with these individuals to ascertain whether they were appropriate for that function, and then a decision would be taken at a much higher level whether they would be used, and that would include contractual arrangements and to inform that final decision. And then there would be a covering letter went with the packages to, again, just outline in summary fashion what they were being requested to do and agreeing to, you know, their contractual arrangements and specifying what information we were hoping they provide.
And who was responsible for selecting the evidence that would build that picture?
I was involved in that partly, but I think Billy Little and John McSpawn there would be a collective involvement in that, and then a final sign-off of the completed document that are satisfied with the content and presentation of it.
Now, you've given some detail in your inquiry statement about the issue that arose with Ashley Wise's statement. And I think a paragraph had been
Yeah, I believe so. There was
omitted.
Yes.
As I understand your inquiry statement, a typist had omitted an important paragraph from that. I'm interested in the sort of quality assurance process in place in relation to the expert witness package. So was there somebody checking that everything, all the information being given to the experts was complete beyond yourself? Was there anyone that was helping with that or managing that process?
Yes, there were. I'm not 100%, but I think that would have fallen between the lead investigator and their deputy, the final sign-off on the packages.
And would you expect the lead investigator or their deputy to be checking that individual statements were complete?
Possibly. I don't think they would read through and check word for word. You know, there's an expectation that the statements, when they're taken, most of them are in handwritten form. They'll then be typed, and then they are proofread by the investigators that are taking them, and that's a core part of that process. So
in
the
terms
expectation would be that is correct at that stage. So if a package were getting put together, I don't think I'd be anticipating the lead investigator would be reading every statement and comparing that with the other version of it.
So in terms of that comparison between the handwritten version and the typed version, would it be the individual investigator who took that statement that you would expect carry out
More
that?
often than not, the written statements would be dictated. They would be typed by administration staff. Then they would be checked by the investigator that took it and confirm. And if there was any discrepancies, spelling mistakes, anything that was missing, that would go back and get taken care of.
If the investigator dictates the content of a statement that he or she's taken, but for some reason omits a paragraph, how would the typist know?
They wouldn't.
They wouldn't.
They'll type what they get, and but when it comes back, the written version should be getting checked against the typed version.
So again, would that go back to the original investigator to do that process
On
of
most
checking?
occasions, but you know there'll be occasions when they are absent and whatever. So, but somebody else, it should be done in every case by someone.
What if the investigator makes a mistake or intentionally leaves out some key information? How would that be checked and corrected before use was made of the statement?
If the written version was not the same as the typed version,
Yes.
it's hard to say. It might not be corrected.
And does that remain the position today?
Yeah, I don't know exactly how the Ashley Wise situation came about and was subsequently identified. I can't recall what the specifics of that was.
You know it was identified. Did all the experts then receive a fresh copy of the typed version?
I don't remember. I'm not sure.
Presumably you would have expected that to be corrected for the experts.
Yeah, I don't recollect when that omission was identified, so I don't know if the whole process has gone through and their reports had been submitted. I don't remember at what stage that was identified and what the subsequent actions to resolve that were.
Can I ask you, have you had any training? Is it common for investigators to be involved in instructing experts and pulling together an expert witness package?
No, it's not. No, it's not common. It doesn't happen. Again, it's very critical, significant incidents where you would go to that length to acquire that sort of evidence. And obviously more in the police world, it would be like, so, murder investigations, other serious where you would acquire that type of evidence. Obviously different for us, different types of investigations, but still high level.
When you, as a PIRC investigator, prior to the 3rd of May 2015, had you been involved in instructing experts in investigations?
I don't think so, no.
Had you received any training in PIRC about instructing an expert in the proper way of doing that?
No.
Have you had any training since?
No. I don't know if there is a defined way of doing that, and whether there's such a thing as a course in relation to that. I would doubt it, to be honest. I'm certainly not aware of any specific focused training on that subject matter.
You're not aware of it? So
No.
you've never had anything like that with the
No.
police? As a police officer, did you have to get involved with instructing experts?
I don't recall ever doing that in the police world.
Right. Do you know who was it that would identify the expert as suitable? Someone who would have the correct qualifications and experience, who would meet the criteria that he would or she would be able to assist the PIRC investigation?
I certainly did some of that during the early stages of that process, and was actioned to do that by the lead investigators.
How did you find that, given you'd not had any training or real experience in instructing experts?
I went to other organisations who did, for instance, the College of Policing, and who hold databases on experts in a lot of different fields, and who have done that on behalf of police forces and other agencies over a period.
And did you give them a list of criteria or qualifications or experience that you were looking to be identified?
Yeah, I think it was subject areas, the types of experts for specific things.
Mainly the subject area?
Yeah, like restraint and under the influence of drugs, that type of thing. So we got a number of responses back for, I say I don't know how many subject headings there were, and then the backgrounds of these individuals were passed up the chain to consider these, and I think ultimately they would go to Crown for a definitive on whether they would or would not be instructed.
Did you go through a process where you looked at the information you'd been sent, say, by the College of Policing, and confirm that that expert or that individual met the criteria that PIRC?
Yes.
I think you were involved in preparing an expert witness package for Dr. Karch.
Yes.
Did you look at his criteria and his qualifications and experience?
No.
Any reason why?
Well, I did once. I saw initially that, not initially, I think it may have been John McSporran that had identified his apparent specialism in a certain area, and then I think I was the first person to contact him to establish and get some background on where his specialist area was, and I had a number of communications with him.
What was your understanding of his specialist area?
I think it was in relation to the effects of it's just escaped me the name of this, alpha PVP.
We've heard some evidence from about toxicology and about substances. Was it your view that Dr. Karch had expertise in toxicology or understanding illicit substances?
I didn't have an in-depth, I say initially the research that identified him, I wasn't involved in doing that, but then progressed to contacting him, and then subsequently I think he was authorised by Crown as an expert witness, and then a package was sent to him in the manner I described in the statement.
And as part of that, did you ask him for a CV or to provide
Yes.
information about his qualifications?
Sure I did, yeah.
Can I ask you about a letter that was sent from the Commissioner, Kate Frame, to Amar Anwar on the 9th of October 2015. This is PIRC 01849. And I'm interested in page 6. So this is a letter from the Commissioner to the solicitor who was representing the family.
Yeah.
Yes, here it is. As you may be aware, do you see that paragraph there just coming
Yep.
up into the middle of the screen? In order to facilitate the examination by your expert, Dr. Nat Carey, of histology and other samples, a PIRC investigator travelled to Dr. Carey's home with the samples and remained while he examined them. Dr. Carey asked who the experts chosen by Crown were and was informed that they were Dr. Karch and Dr. Payne James. Dr. Carey expressed his professional regard for the significant expertise of both persons, considering Dr. Karch to be one of the most eminent and expert practitioners in the world in the field of cardiopathology. Now, can I ask you first of all, was it you that went to take samples to Dr. Carey?
It was, yeah.
And he was an expert. We've heard evidence from Dr. Carey, and he was an expert that was originally contacted by Amar Anwar and company.
Yeah, aware of that, yeah.
And you were then the investigator who travelled to Dr. Carey's home with samples.
Yes.
Now, where it says there, the investigator, namely you, remained while he examined them, so remained there while Dr. Carey examined them. Did you remain there while Dr. Carey examined them?
No.
How is it that the Commissioner has come to write that in this letter to Amar Anwar?
I don't know.
Did you have a conversation with the Commissioner about this?
Not to my recollection, no.
Did you provide any written documentation or other communication to the Commissioner about the situation with Dr. Carey and the delivery of the samples?
I have no recollection of doing that. No.
So as far as you're aware, where did that information come from that the Commissioner's put in this letter?
I don't know. There's obviously an inference within that I've had a discussion with Dr. Carey regarding other experts. I have no recollection of that. I do. The only thing I remember is going there. I remember meeting him and possibly his wife. We were in the hallway of the house somewhere, and I think he had his own room where he carried out examinations within the premises there. I had no recollection, and I would be surprised if I specifically mentioned experts' names to him. I'm not discounting that happened, but I would think that unlikely. I certainly have no recollection of doing that whatsoever, or the references to Dr. Karch's eminence in that field.
And so on this second part of that paragraph, do you remember Dr. Carey asking you who the experts chosen by the Crown were?
You know, what I've said to you is all I can remember about that visit, and obviously this information has come from somewhere, and it could only come from that visit, I would have thought, and anything that was fed back, but I honestly cannot remember discussing other. I was there for a purpose, which was to deposit that stuff with Dr. Carey, allow him to do his examination, and then return with the same items.
So, in relation to that paragraph in the letter by the Commissioner, do you have any recollection about the circumstances that are described in that paragraph?
No, other than attending Dr. Carey's home. If discussions took place, I gather, sorry, I just do not recall that. I say I'm not discounting that it happened, but I cannot give any more information or detail on that.
Were you with anybody else
No.
that day? No. Thank you. Can I ask you to look at PIRC 01858, please? And this is a letter from Amar Anwar to PIRC for the attention of the Commissioner, Kate Frame, which sets out a number of concerns about the selection of Dr. Karch as an expert witness. So this letter is dated the 6th of November 2015. The previous letter I just asked you about was 9th of October 2015. So this is the following month that this letter is written. And with reference to Dr. Carey's alleged endorsement of Dr. Karch, and he makes reference to the letter of the 9th of October that we've just looked at, Mr. Amar Anwar advises the Commissioner that Dr. Carey, and the quotation in the letter says, Dr. Carey is said to say, I did not lend any support to the instruction of either Dr. Payne James or Dr. Karch. It is extremely disappointing if this facilitation is now being used as a means of manufacturing my implied support for the instruction of Dr. Karch. Were you aware that there'd been subsequent correspondence between Mr. Anwar and the Commissioner in relation to the issue of either Dr. Karch or Dr. Carey?
I think the only thing I had any memory of was reference made to my visit and not being there for a period of time.
Did the Commissioner or anyone else in PIRC come back to you about this matter round about the November of that year to ask
No.
you further questions about?
I don't have any recollection of that now. I don't know what the timeline here is in relation to when Dr. Karch was initially identified and when the visit to Dr. Carey's was. I don't recall what that was and how relevant that is.
I can take you through your statement if you wish, but I don't think the date so much
No,
makes any difference. The letter in October from the Commissioner was 9th of October, and that's the paragraph that she'd written in relation to the matter regarding Dr. Carey and Dr. Karch was dated the 9th of October. So, I'm going to move on to another passage of evidence now. I wonder if that might be an appropriate time for the break.
We'll take a 15-minute break. Ms. Graham.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to another topic now, Mr. Harrower. We've heard from you that PIRC were, from the very outset, investigating the events at Hayfield Road and the death of Mr. Bio, the cause of his death. And from the beginning, that was part of the terms of reference from the Crown
Yes.
to PIRC. In terms of a PIRC investigation where there is an unascertained death and you're investigating the cause of that death as part of your investigation, do you have a certain amount of discretion as to how the best way to go about that investigation, say into cause of death?
Yes, depending on what those terms of reference actually are, and then your investigation would expand out where you see fit. If there was need for consultation with Crown at some stage where it was a significant expansion of that, then it would be appropriate to correspond with them and consult them in relation to it.
I asked a number of the senior police officers about their approach to investigating an unexplained death, and we heard mention of something called the murder manual and how they develop hypotheses. Do PIRC investigators take a similar approach when they're investigating an unexplained death?
I would say so. I mean, they certainly have considerations or hypotheses about what potentially at the outset would be the relevant matters to consider, and conduct your inquiries to negate any of these as it progresses.
We've heard from Pat Campbell about he started thinking about hypotheses on the way to Kirkcaldy that day, and we've heard from Leslie Bowell about the type of hypotheses she had in her mind that she would be considering.
And I think he mentioned that we had discussed some of these as well at an early stage.
Right. And I think, as I understand this method or this use of hypotheses, they are developed over a period of time, investigated, and then once where there's no evidence to support a hypothesis, then it can be eliminated. But you have to wait until you can be sure that there's no evidence to support it.
Yes.
Would you agree with that
Yes,
type of approach? Can I then ask you about some of the evidence we've heard about the type of hypotheses that the police may have considered in relation to the events of the 3rd of May, and just see if the PIRC investigation mirrored that approach? Leslie Bowell, for example, gave evidence to the inquiry that potentially there may have been criminality on the part of the police officers, and that could have been one of the hypotheses that was investigated into the cause of death.
Yes.
And there may have been an underlying medical condition that may be caused or contributed to Mr. Bio's death.
Yep.
And a way of investigating that type of thing would be to recover GP records, maybe take information from the family about Mr. Bio's health. Agree with that?
Yep.
She talked about race as a possibility, it being in the back of your mind when you're thinking about all the possibilities. In terms of hypotheses, one would have been that the male had been treated differently because he was a black male. Would you agree with that hypothesis?
That wasn't one of my considerations initially. I said keeping an open mind to that, but at the forefront was what you've mentioned already. The fact that he may have sustained an injury immediately prior to his interaction with the police, were aware that he was involved, and so that was a consideration that there may have been criminal conduct by others prior to at any of these locations that we'd previously mentioned that were coming under the responsibility of Police Scotland at that time. There was excessive use of force in Hayfield Road itself, and that may be even combined with one of the underlying medical conditions considerations that you've made mention.
So as I understand the use of hypotheses, it's considering all the possibilities that may have caused the death of Mr. Bayo, not fixing on any particular one, not favouring any particular one, but keeping an open mind about all of them and investigating each possible hypothesis, seeing if there's evidence to support it. If ultimately there's no evidence, that can be eliminated. Is that a fair summary? So you would have been keeping an open mind about all of the hypotheses
Yes.
that were possibilities. So criminality on the part of the police, excessive use of force in Hayfield Road, a previous assault, medical condition,
Yeah.
perhaps
Drugs.
drinking drugs could have been a
drinking drugs.
factor. And equally, as Bol has said, is one of the things that you'd keep an open mind about, that Mr. Bayo had perhaps been treated differently because he was a black male. And that, when I say treated differently by the officers. And that the actions taken by them were because he was black. Was that a hypothesis that you considered?
That wasn't at the forefront of my mind at that time, I say, but
Was it
clearly
the back of your mind?
it was open-minded to that. But considering, you know, the evidence that was available and information at the time, and that there were these previous incidents in the lead-up to it, which suggested that is probably more likely as a consideration at that time. So they were higher on the list, I would say.
So
as
were
a
you
consideration.
were you categorising in terms of likelihood already?
In my mind, yes,
In
and
your
just you know, and that would be reassessed at different stages as additional information came in, and obviously later in the inquiry there still was consideration and evidence to support that drugs had been taken at some time, so that would remain a higher.
And in carrying out that process of categorisation and considering some more likely than others, did that have an impact on you keeping an open mind? Did that start to close down perhaps
No, I
your
wouldn't say
mind?
so, no.
Now, I think you've given us a lot of information in your second statement. And without going through all of the paragraphs, I think at paragraph 209 you say you can't be positive, but you don't believe PIRC had ever considered the issue of race in an investigation before the 3rd of May 2015. 208, prior to the 3rd of May, you say, I had no experience of an investigation of a death in custody or following police contact where race was a factor in the investigation. I do not recall ever having worked in an investigation since the death of Sheku Bayo where race was a factor.
I don't believe so, no.
Is do you disagree with any of that, or
No,
feel that any of that's
certainly no recollection. I would be surprised if it changed from that.
Oh, thank you. Paragraph 207, prior to the 3rd of May, you say, I had no experience of an investigation of a death in custody or a death following police contact in which the deceased was someone from an ethnic minority, and I have no recollection of dealing with one since the death of Sheku Bayo either. Does that remain the same?
Yes.
See. Now, yesterday you spoke about having led on 3 deaths in custody, and I think I asked you some questions about that.
No,
You didn't
I couldn't recall
recollect
exactly what they
that.
were.
From those answers in your statement, is it fair to say that none of the 3 deaths in custody you had investigated involved any issues of race?
Not to my recollection at all, no.
Right. Thank you. Now, it was on the 2nd of September 2015, perhaps we can look at this, that a letter was sent from the Crown to the Commissioner, Kate Frame, and that's COPFS 02557. And you'll see this is a letter from Crown Office to Kate Frame, 2nd of September 2015. And if we move down the page, please, and if we can look at page 4, I think it is. It's a detailed letter, and it starts, I require confirmation from the Commissioner that issues of race and whether there is any evidence of racial motivation is a primary focus in the PIRC investigation. The investigation should examine whether there is any evidence that any of the officers, I think that should say officers, involved has expressed any racist views or opinions in the past. In particular, indicated that officers from within the Fife area had been investigated for texting racial slogans and that one of the officers was referred to him. The family have inquired as to whether any of those officers apparently involved in that inquiry were in the group of officers engaged with Mr. Bio. So this was a separate matter. We've heard some evidence from
Yep.
D.I. Robson about a separate matter regarding WhatsApp messages and involving other officers who were not any of the 9 officers who attended at Hayfield Road. Had there been any, when you were involved as lead investigator or in any of your involvement with the investigation after that date, was there any mention of race by the Crown to PIRC prior to this letter that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
So up until this point, race has not been part of the written correspondence or terms of reference with the Crown, as I understand
Not
it.
to my knowledge, no.
Can you tell us then, if you know, what steps were taken, if any, prior to the 2nd of September, when PIRC were keeping an open mind about these matters, to consider the aspect of race as part of the investigation? So this is prior to that letter from the Crown.
I think John McSporran or Billy Little would need to comment on that. I
right.
can't give you any specific answer on that.
Okay. In your role as an investigator involved in the investigation, obviously you've taken statements from at least one officer. You took statements from DS Dursley, I think, and a trainer, Inspector Young. Was there any discussions amongst PIRC about race and investigating race prior to the 2nd of September?
Not to my knowledge, no.
After this letter came in from the Crown on the 2nd of September, were you aware of steps being taken to look into the issue of race?
I was aware in general terms that actions were being raised in response to this extension to the terms of reference, basically.
And what changes were put in place after this letter was received from the Crown?
Changes as in?
What additional steps were taken to look into the issue of race after this letter was received?
There was certainly investigation conducted in relation to Fife officers, etc., and to answer that specific point that you've detailed there. What, I can't tell you exactly what they were.
And were the investigations carried out focused on that issue regarding Fife officers and texting?
Yes, I believe so, yeah.
Any other expansion of the investigation to incorporate issues of race?
Not that I'm aware of, but again, that's something that they would be able to answer specifically and in detail, I'm quite sure.
Better to ask
Very much
Little
so.
or McSporran. So if I have additional questions regarding whether discrimination was considered or the type of discrimination that was considered or statements obtained, would I be better speaking to Mr. McSporran about
I
that?
would say so, yes.
In your role as an investigator, were you ever tasked with obtaining any statements
Not in relation to
primarily
that
in
aspect.
relation to race?
Yeah.
No. Were you ever asked to seek guidance on investigating race, or
No.
were you ever tasked with looking at how previous inquiries or investigations had looked at race and investigated race? Were you ever tasked with seeking guidance from third parties who may be able to assist in preparing a strategy to look at race?
No, I wasn't, not personally.
Were you ever asked to speak to someone who maybe had experience or lived experience in relation to an investigation in relation to race?
No, I wasn't.
Were you ever asked to seek guidance from anyone in Crown Office in relation to what further investigations the Crown may have wished PIRC to carry out in relation to race?
No, I wasn't.
Were you ever asked to do any sort of analysis of the statements you had to consider the use of any racial language or racially stereotypical language
No.
that may
Not personally.
have... Sorry, what was
Not personally, I
Not
wasn't. no.
personally. Were you aware of anyone carrying out that comparison?
No, I don't know the full extent of what actions were placed to cover the race issues that you're talking about. There was a lot, I'm quite certain of that, but I don't know the specifics of all of those and how far that extended and whether review of previous material that we had got into the investigation.
So again, is it fair to say you think perhaps Mr McSporran
Yes.
or maybe Mr Mitchell would be in a better position to help me with that?
They would.
In the statement you took from Craig Walker, he made mention as part of that about a terrorist threat, the threat level at that stage.
Yeah, I think that was one of, I can't remember your terminology, but basically the thoughts going through an officer's head before they actually arrived, and I think he alluded to that was one of the things that he had considered prior to his arrival.
Did you consider, perhaps when you were taking a statement from Constable Walker, consider that that might have been an indication of a link in his mind between terrorism and the fact that Mr Bile was black?
I don't recall.
Do you remember asking any questions about that or exploring that as an issue?
Not specifically, no.
Nowadays, is there more guidance available to PIRC investigators in relation to carrying out investigations regarding race?
Internally or externally?
Internally, I was thinking, I'll show you the document I'm interested in.
Please.
This is PIRC 04724, and the inquiry's received a copy of these guidelines, PIRC guidelines, for dealing with allegations of discrimination when undertaking investigations and complaint handling reviews, but I'm particularly interested in the investigations part. Now, the pages are numbered top right-hand side, and my understanding is that this document came into existence in 2021. Have you seen this document before?
I think so, yeah.
Have you read this document before?
I believe I have, yeah.
Have you had training in relation to the content of the document?
Not that I recall. And
Were you, in terms of having read through it, was that something you were given time to do? Was there any discussion with fellow colleagues about the content?
I don't remember when it was circulated of its existence, but it obviously will appear on our internal systems for reference when required.
We've heard about documents that are available to police officers on their internal systems, but some of them we've heard evidence that some of them find it very difficult to carve out time to read those documents because they're so busy on their shifts. Is that something that you experience in PIRC, given your workload?
I don't think that the volume is anywhere near what Police Scotland have as far as procedural documents and standard operating procedures. There's huge numbers to deal with, the various types of incidents.
So in terms of having access to documents and the time to read them, is that something that PIRC investigators are very comfortable with fitting in their day?
I would say they're certainly readily accessible, and invariably when a new document is created, there will be a communication, a circulation highlighting what it is and where it is.
And was it that circulation that gave rise to you reading this document?
I would think so. I can't remember for sure.
I mean, are you comfortable that you've read this document in its entirety?
I'm sure I have, yeah.
And do you remember when you did?
No, I don't.
So if you were faced with an allegation or an investigation today that involved a black man, an unexplained death, perhaps issues of possible racial discrimination or excessive use of force, would you go to these guidelines to provide you with assistance?
Yeah, I think we all would, and refer to a variety of things to inform the way that we approach it.
Well, can I ask you, I'm not going to read out this entire document, that it's available for the chair to consider in detail, but would you look at page 30? I think it says the investigation section. On page 2 it says section 6 is conducting an investigation, and that's at page 30. But I should have put a post-it on this. Here we are. It's actually, I think on my copy it's page 31, but it's conducting an investigation or case handling review. Do you see that?
Yes.
And this is the section which sets out, it says here, investigating and review officers, that would be someone like yourself, should have a detailed understanding of equality and diversity issues and an appropriate level of knowledge, skills and experience to be able to apply these guidelines and undertake effective investigations. So is the advice and guidance here that's contained in section 6 designed by PIRC to provide investigators with a route map or
knowledge and support to do their appropriate function?
Undertaking an investigation which may involve possible racial discrimination or race issues? And you agree with
yes.
that?
Yeah.
Have you found this, I appreciate that you said you've not been involved in any investigations regarding race since these guidelines came out, but having read the document, has this guidance been easy to read? Have you found it helpful? There are a number of practical
it's
examples.
Like various, you will go and seek these out and read in more detail and refresh the memory from the initial reading of it to guide yourself and make sure that you're approaching things in a proper fashion.
And then we see on page 31 on the screen, it sets the terms of reference for an investigation into a death that raises issues of discrimination should explicitly refer to and address any discrimination allegations raised. And where there's no specific allegation of discrimination, but it's apparent that discrimination may be a relevant consideration, you've also to refer to these guidelines. And so it gives advice about understanding the allegation, conducting the investigation, using a comparator to see if that's of assistance. It comments on discriminatory language, probing accounts. Is this, looking at that now, would that have been of assistance to you in 2015, all of that advice?
I think so. More than of assistance, it's a kind of direction to follow in certain instances.
So if you were in a situation today as you were on the 3rd of May 2015, would this document have been invaluable to you in deciding how to investigate?
It would have assisted, I think.
Thank you. Can I ask you about lessons learned? I've asked a number of people about learning lessons after the 3rd of May 2015. And can we look at your second statement, which is the 3821, paragraph 7. And you're asked here about lessons learned, and it says here, during the course of or at the conclusion of more complex investigations, debriefs are sometimes held. This provides an opportunity to identify learning and other relevant information for future investigations. This involves a structured meeting with management and the investigation team involved, where the key parts of the investigation are discussed in detail. Any relevant actions are taken forward. I'm interested in this process that's adopted in PIRC. Can you help us understand on what occasions would this type of process be embarked upon, the lessons learned process?
It's more often at the direction of one of the very senior members of staff, the Director of Operations probably, in relation to the justification and need for doing that. It's not done as a matter of course, it's selective, just depending on the investigation, possibly what's established process-wise within that has maybe caused issues, and there may be a need after that to cascade that learning out to Police Scotland or any other agencies who are responsible for to discuss that and make changes in processes for the future.
So this process doesn't necessarily just have to be an internal process. It can be
no, not necessarily there. I mean, there's, if you're going to have significant learning, and it does involve the participation and taking on board from partner agencies, and we would do that.
In your experience, have you found these exercises to be beneficial in improving practice internally or dealings with third parties?
Yeah, both. Yeah.
Both. And you say that that's held sometimes. You said it depends on the investigation. Does it depend on the manager?
I think it's more on the complexity and the potential for learning and significant process change that really you can't go to another similar type of investigation without that changing in the interim period, so that that process works better. So I say it would normally come about by direction from one of the senior managers. Whether that may be cascaded upwards with a suggestion that occurs, but it's obviously involving a lot of people, a lot of time, significant discussion. So I say it doesn't happen for every investigation, nothing like it. So.
And then you go on to say no debrief was held in relation to the death of Mr. Bio. This would have been a decision for senior management in the PIRC at that time. It is difficult to form an opinion at this late stage on whether any benefits would have been derived from this. Now, can you think of a reason why there would not have been this debrief or
well, that was certainly from my knowledge. I don't know in my absence if anything occurred. I don't think it was, but again, probably John McSporn will be able to confirm that 100%. Why it didn't happen, I don't know. I can't give you an answer to that. I don't know.
And you've said in your statement it's difficult to form an opinion on whether benefits would have been derived. But in light, obviously, we've been talking for 2 days now nearly. We've been going through a lot of different aspects of the investigation. And I wonder, in light of that and my questions, do you think that there may have been opportunities for learning that if there had been this
Undoubtedly
exercise?
there were, and I say soon after that there were very significant changes, and maybe that was effectively a debrief at a much higher partnership level that happened, and probably at the top of that list is the post-incident process. I can't remember when discussions started fairly soon. Took quite a while to actually implement those full changes, but that's now an integral part of the whole process for this type of incident, and is a massive change in how these critical incidents are dealt with.
This may be my ignorance, but I imagine a debrief involves input from the staff who were
At every
involved
level,
in the investigation,
Yeah.
because that's a positive way of really learning lessons and improving things from the people who lived that experience.
Yeah, even smaller issues that collectively can make a difference.
So if there had been a lessons learned exercise or a debrief, can you think of a reason why the first lead investigator on the 3rd of May wouldn't have been included as part of that conversation?
No.
I'd like to ask you a couple of clarification points that arise out of your evidence yesterday, and just to cover those at the moment, if you don't mind. I didn't have a document ID number yesterday and became a little bit confused about a document, and I said I would
The different
stop digging
handwriting.
to remember that. Could you look at PIRC 04528, please? And we'll look at page 1. Alternatively, we could look at, this was the document we had on the screen yesterday. Now, this handwriting, as I understand it, comes from Richard Casey's notebook. So it wasn't your handwriting, it was
No.
Richard Casey's handwriting. And it was Richard Casey who was having a conversation, as I understand it, on Sunday the 3rd of May 2015 at 10 a.m. with yourself, Harrower.
Yep.
And it was during this conversation that he noted the words, and I find it quite difficult to read there, but he noted the words political side. Now, it's quite faint on the screen as it appears there, but you see it just under the Dave Green instruction and then political side.
Yes.
Do you see that there? And then there is the word K question mark. Do you see that?
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you have any recollection about what was meant during that conversation with Miss Investigator Casey that would have prompted him to write down political side.
None whatsoever, and it was mainly a one-sided conversation by way of updating him on the incident, what the instruction was,
Right.
and what the intentions were as far as staffing. Obviously those words are beside, I think I agree it is K question mark, most likely would be the media representative for PIRC at the time.
Well, that's very helpful. So we've heard evidence from an Inspector K, but this would have been a reference to...
I very much doubt it was
K.
him, because certainly at that early stage it's unlikely.
And was this a person within PIRC that dealt with media?
Yes, at that time.
At that time.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, the other thing I want to clear up with you is in relation to the comments you made yesterday about Gary Sinclair.
Yep.
You talked about him being tasked to recover the equipment, the clothing of the officers. And you gave that as a possible explanation why he didn't turn up till Hayfield Road until 7:20.
Till later, yeah.
7:20. In his inquiry statement, we've not heard evidence from Gary Sinclair, but in his inquiry statement, for those behind me, the copies of this will be available in due course. Recovery of the clothing, footwear and officer safety equipment was not my responsibility, but was a discussion that was with DSI Harrower. I'm just wondering, because I had the impression yesterday from yourself that the recovery of the clothing was Gary Sinclair's responsibility.
Yeah, I said to you previously that we were under the impression that had taken place very early, but I think once we got to the office that that hadn't been completed. I don't know if it had started, and we had discussions with Stuart Hewson as the coordinator regarding that. So my recollection is that basically as part of the Hayfield Road scene that Gary and his colleague would bring that matter to a conclusion. And I say, and that was in combination with the CS or Pava canisters, that the additional request that we made in relation to them. So that was my recollection of how that unfolded at the time, and it was offered as a potentially an explanation of that, but his sort of complete involvement in that aspect, I didn't have great detail of that. It was just he had ownership of that, the Hayfield Road location.
So as far as you were concerned, he was there to help with Hayfield Road?
Yeah, he was going to scene manage that from the PIRC perspective in liaison with the Police Scotland senior manager.
Right. You had spoke yesterday about a briefing at Hamilton, at your offices on the 3rd of May.
Yes.
I think from memory, was it 11:55 or 12 o'clock during the day that briefing had taken place?
Yeah, I could give it the times in the
Right.
diary.
You'd talked about investigators coming to Hamilton to collect vehicles, receive the briefing, and maybe collect equipment, I think.
Possibly, yeah.
Possibly.
For the additional things that the scene managers may
Right.
require. I don't know, because I don't think any of the on-call staff were scene managers per se, and that's why we had the additional. What I meant to mention yesterday, we spoke at length about, the time of response from initial call out to them arriving, that virtually all of the members of staff that were called out stayed very close to Hamilton, apart from one whose, I'm sure, his route would come fairly close to that in the way back, just to kind of indicate my thoughts were there not a huge amount of time lost, and the benefits of doing the other things and discussing the incident and giving them a knowledge of that, and then being able to consider that en route was advantageous.
Thank you. I think in your statement you've spoken at one point about collecting production kits from PIRC's offices. Would that be the type of equipment?
That would be part of what the scene managers would have at their disposal.
Right.
As well as the other investigators need that as well. But
we've been in the process of getting a statement from Kate Frame, the Commissioner, at the time, and in part of her statement she says that there was some material contained in the on-call kit which provided a cultural awareness of various faiths and their related beliefs and practices. We've not had any indication from other witnesses that an on-call kit exists or what that is. We don't hold that in evidence. Is that something that you're aware of having at the time that's maybe no longer used?
at that time, I'm not sure. Certainly more recently that we have large black hard case boxes that would be termed as a on-call kit that would have those sort of items within. What we had at that time, I'm not quite sure. I don't remember.
Do you use that sort of thing now?
Yeah, they would be in they'd either be in or would be taken into whatever vehicles are getting used to go as a ready-made location for the production labels, bags,
Preserve evidence from the scene.
statement paper, whatever else, tape for assisting taping off scenes and other material.
Thank you. And then I'd like to ask you something about, I discussed this yesterday with you about the death message.
Yes.
And the delivery of the death message by Police Scotland officers. And I'm wondering, obviously you were lead investigator on the 3rd of May regarding the death of Mr. Bio. And I asked you yesterday about delivery of the death message and whether you thought there could have been a more active role taken by PIRC in the delivery of that death message. And I think you explained timing might be difficult to do that. But do you think as the lead investigator in the future you could have an opportunity to contribute to the death message, perhaps to ensure consistency, to ensure accuracy about information that's being given to the family?
I don't know, I think that's a difficult one because it obviously emphasised the need for death messages to be passed swiftly and efficiently, that how much information has to be in that to begin with. I don't think it has to be significant, that hopefully that will be followed up with the interaction and proper communication at an early stage thereafter, but the fact that that message is passed and the family don't establish that information from elsewhere, so I think that in itself negates the involvement of PIRC in any way, and that's, to my mind, it's a police responsibility to do that and to do it within a very reasonable time frame.
Well, I'm going to ask you this question, but I think your last answer probably answers it. Given that, looking back now at the circumstances that existed on the 3rd of May 2015, do you think that PIRC, yourself as lead investigator, should have been involved or could have assisted in clarifying, identifying what the family should and could have been told and when they were told? Do you think that's something that PIRC could or should have been involved in?
I don't think so, and I say the limited information that we passed initially, that is basically making them aware that a family member is dead. Later on, different as far as how much information is passed and at what stage and the relevance of that.
And so, in a sense, would you rely on the flows to provide
expand
that
on
as
once it's more factual and information, because it just makes the situation worse if, with the best of intentions, you're trying to give the family more information, but it transpires that that's flawed and incorrect, and you sometimes can't recover from that.
Thank you. Could you give me one moment, please?
Sure.
Thank you very much. That concludes my examination.
Thank you. Are there any Rule 9 applications? Ms. Mitchell and Ms. McCall. Mr. Harrower, would you withdraw to the witness room while I hear submissions, please? Ms. Mitchell. Yes, Ms. Mitchell.
My Lord, in relation to a document which my learned friend looked at, PIRC 03694, this is the minute, the briefing note of the 3rd of May, and the witness was asked about this in particular, the section about it being reported that that quotes, they could clearly see he was in possession of a knife and was making his way towards them. Now, of course, we know this not to be true, and in evidence this witness said it wasn't as initially reported in the early information that we had. Now, we know from other witnesses that the first 24 hours, they're called the golden hours, are the most important of an investigation. In the early hours of the investigation, this was what was understood. And the question that I would like to ask is, did he become suspicious that someone at some point had suggested that officers had clearly seen him in possession of a knife when he in fact had no knife? Did this cause him to investigate who said this and why? And finally, had this been an inquiry in relation to civilians and he'd come across this information and then such a change, would have it caused him to examine the issue further? Certainly, had it been an inquiry in relation to civilians, when he'd come across evidence or that he understood the early evidence to be that a man approached holding a knife and then come to find out that wasn't the evidence, would that have caused him to investigate further? What I'm seeking to do there is test whether or not there was some kind of different standard applied in relation to civilians as it was in relation to the officers that were there. I would respectfully submit that it would seem likely if police officers had heard at an early stage that someone had a knife and came towards them, and then from whatever source that story changed, that might be something that would make an investigating officer want to inquire about it more. So that's the basis of that question. The next question I would like to ask of the witness, which I don't think was covered, forgive me if I'm wrong in this regard, was were you aware that it had been said that the police officers would not give a statement until the outcome of the post-mortem had been done? And if so, did you discuss this with the Crown representative, Dave Green? The next questions arise under the discussion that my learned friend had in respect of PIRC 04182. That is the document which sets out various questions for the police officers, the investigations. And in respect of the heading arrest and restraint, what I would like to ask him is, if a black man had died after being detained by officers after restraint, it would presumably be important to ask how he was restrained, which officer restrained him, and to ask them to describe what they did or what they saw others do in respect of the restraint. And with reference to that document, there simply are none of those questions asked. The next and final issue relates to questions that were asked by my learned friend in connection with Kate Frame and Dr. Karsh. And he was asked whether or not the Commissioner or anyone else in PIRC came back to him about matters around about the November of that year to ask further questions about it. And his answer was that he did not have any recollection of that, no. There is a document, PIRC number 01856, 01856, open brackets A, close brackets. And that is a letter from Kate Frame to solicitors Anwar Anwar and Company that records that Ms. Frame did have a conversation with DSI Harrower about this, and sets out that there appeared to have been what is described as a misinterpretation of SI Harrower's rehearsal of a conversation, which in turn has led to a phrase eminent and expert practitioner being erroneously referred to. What I would like to ask him about this matter, if it jogs his memory any, was, first of all, why he didn't stay with the samples. My learned friend obtained from him confirmation he didn't stay with the samples, but didn't ask why he didn't stay with the samples, or ought he to have stayed with the samples. Whether or not he told Dr. Carey that he was going sightseeing in Norwich, and whether or not it prompts his memory in any way, if I put that part of the letter from Kate's frame to him to see whether or not that jogs his memory in relation to those discussions having been had.
Could you just go back to your first point?
Yes. Yes, certainly. We've heard evidence about how important it is to gather evidence at an early stage in proceedings, and I think it was Detective Chief Inspector Keith Hardy that said that the golden hours, the first 24 hours, are your best opportunities to gather evidence. The earliest briefing note we appear to have on the 3rd of May says it was reported that as officers drove into Hayfield Road, they saw the now deceased... Sorry, yeah.
Clarify, is that the briefing note that he provided to his superior officers? The one we were discussing this afternoon? The printed one?
Yes, this is a printed one, yes.
Yeah.
Typed up one.
For the attention of the managing officer or something like that?
Indeed, I think so.
That's the one you're talking
Yes.
about, all right.
03694 is the PIRC reference number. 03694. I've just asked someone to check to ensure that that is the right one. So the evidence of this witness was that the collective had provided information which was assimilated together, and that collective provided information which was put in the briefing note of the 3rd of May, which said it was reported that as the officers drove into Hayfield Road, they saw the now deceased coming towards them as the vehicles came to a halt. They could clearly see he was in possession of a knife and was making his way towards them. And really what I'm wanting to ask is, it became clear to him at a later stage that that was not the case.
Well, is there any evidence of that?
Well, he says at 106:20, the knife had been recovered and potentially that wasn't as initially reported in the early information that we had. So that's the evidence he gave to this inquiry.
Did he say when he had received that information?
I don't think so. He just said the knife had been recovered and potentially that wasn't as initially reported in the early information that we had. I'm afraid it doesn't specify a time. But regardless of when it was, Lord, I would respectfully submit that the question holds good, which is, if you've heard that and then you hear a different story, would that not cause you to make further inquiries as to why you heard that first story in the golden hours and then it changed to something else? Why was that story being put about by someone? And I would just respectfully submit that a question in that regard would be appropriate, and also to ask, had it been an inquiry in relation to civilians, would it have caused him to examine it further? Those are my questions, Miller.
Thank you.
I'm obliged.
You've actually turned yours.
Yes.
Yes, Ms. McCall.
Sir, it's an issue that arises excuse me, in this afternoon's evidence, and it's the transcript at page 122 to 123. There were questions from senior counsel to the inquiry that appeared to suggest that PIRC investigators may have felt constrained in asking anything beyond the questions set out in the interview strategy. And there was also a question about why the officers were not asked to justify their use of force in terms of that interview strategy. And in that context, Ms. Graham made reference, by way of example, excuse me, to Ross Stewart's interview of Sergeant Maxwell. And an apparent quote from Mr. Stewart's inquiry statement, which is SBPI 00448, which in fact is a Rule 8 response. An apparent quote from that was put to the witness. And the suggestion that was put was that because Mr. Stewart was a less experienced investigator, he may have benefited from a more fulsome strategy document. And following the quote attributed to Ross Stewart, which is on page 122 at lines 14 to 16 of the transcript, the witness was asked to comment. The issue is this, sir, the quote was presented in the form of a single quote, when in fact it comprised two sentences that come from different parts of Mr. Stewart's inquiry statement. And that approach results, in my respectful submission, in a misleading impression of Mr. Stewart's actual evidence. And in fairness to this witness, to Mr. Stewart, and in particular from my perspective to Sergeant Maxwell, I want to put the accurate individual quotes to the witness and ask whether he thinks there was in fact any difference in his approach at the interview to that taken by Ross Stewart, and whether he thinks the interview strategy in light of that did actually constrain investigators or not. And if your lordship requires the source of the quotes, they're SBPI 00448, question 67, and the second part of the quote came from question 73. That's the only issue, my lord.